Let's see what's coming up with Vanguard recently. Neat. Okay, what about Yu-Gi-Oh? What's going on? Let's talk about that. To give some quick context, Bushiroad is having their English conference coming up soon. There's some excitement going on with what's going to be revealed at the conference, but also some things that should be addressed in Vanguard. You may be curious, like, why is Yu-Gi-Oh have to tie with this? But recently, Team APS, a well-known and respected channel, has expressed more and more Yu-Gi-Oh players leaving Yu-Gi-Oh to play different games, specifically Bandai games such as like One Piece, Digimon. So in this video, I'll be covering a little more, more of the context situation and how it applies into Cardfight Vanguard. Secondly, also talk about where a Yu-Gi-Oh player transitioned into Cardfight Vanguard and what aspects really attracted them to even pick up Vanguard versus a different TCG. And in the last part, I'll mention 3 points that I think will help Bushiroad take this opportunity to not only fix things, but also grow beyond. So in Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2024, there was a lot of like I quits, a lot of like frustrations with Konami's decisions, just cards being so much in price that it's just flat out expensive to even keep up with the game. And so there's a lot of distaste with Konami over the years, and it was a lot more relevant this past year. Team APS actually broke down that there's a spectrum of players where there's the modern, competitive, spirited type of players, and on the other side, there's like the GOAT Edison players, which is like the old school format essentially too. And in the middle is the mid-core, or almost like a Yu-Gi-Oh middle class in the sense too, that is, you know, taking out their weekends to really play with their favorite decks and hope to do well, and do it every so often too. Almost like a casual in that respect in between, but it's like they're the ones often getting a lot of distaste whenever Konami drops a ban list, or maybe like some crazy support and the demand for it's so high that it's expensive, and it's a rinse and repeat cycle, which I'll cover more in depth with the other points. These players are now solidifying their TCG experiences with One Piece, Digimon, Union Arena, and what's a concern is that slowly over a course of time, they'll be losing Yu-Gi-Oh players essentially too. So how that relates to Vanguard is that even in the top 10 selling TCGs from the Japan side of things, Vanguard was like in the low end. We even saw One Piece, Digimon, and other Bandai games like pass Cardfight Vanguard. Bushiroad may have white shorts up there as well, but ultimately we just care about Cardfight Vanguard in this channel, and of course with the Vanguard community specifically. And even with the English conference, other people have expressed their own issues too. I know Alec had mentioned about like the distribution of promos, and then also Kai put his 2 cents in, where in Japan it seems good, but then outside of Japan could be better essentially too. And I really started thinking about this in the terms of like my experience and other people over the years that I've seen that they've come from Yu-Gi-Oh because of this distaste. So they so happen to pick up Vanguard for a certain aspect, and there was actually some common themes between all the responses that I got with feedback that I've gotten recently, and also even just over the years too. So the first theme is actually simplified gameplay and accessibility. Coming from Yu-Gi-Oh, you have to develop a skill set of understanding the rulings and also the gameplay that actually transition really well into Vanguard. Once a Yu-Gi-Oh player has gotten a few games with Vanguard, it's very easy for them to just pick it up and understand what's important and when it's not important. Furthermore, it's a lot more fair and more diverse and more balanced than compared to Yu-Gi-Oh's metagames. A lot of the metagames are dictated by 1 or 2, maybe 3 decks too, and sometimes it's like extremely frustrating because there's a huge gap with those decks with the rest of the decks that are in the card pool. If you go to a Vanguard regional, you're going to face a lot of different rogue decks, not only with the metagame too, but it's not a complete blowout. The deck building process is also more simplified than Yu-Gi-Oh. Yu-Gi-Oh literally has the entire card pool accessible for any deck. Card pools with Vanguard, especially with Standard, are just in the nation system, and even prior is like the clan system, which is a much more smaller card pool. What also helps is the accessibility because of the locals, friends, or even just watching the show. One of the biggest highlights that really attracted also me is that they had a show that I could just watch. Not only just watch it because it's an anime, but it also taught me how to play more and kind of see the history of Vanguard, because I didn't start from the very beginning myself. So the show was also another way to just like get people excited and actually wanting to play the TCG too. Plus having some friends like taking a break from Yu-Gi-Oh and being able to like, here's a deck that you can play with and then have a few games around. It was just a lot easier back then too, which I'll cover more on that too later. The second theme is balanced gameplay and reduced power creep. What do I mean by that? Is that essentially as power creep happens with new products, new sets coming out too, it's not such a dramatic gap where everything that you've played is completely useless. In Vanguard, it may take a year, if not 2, to really make a deck useless compared to today's metagame. And that's been like that for over the years too. There have been small instances where, like in V series, for example, there was like a bunch of sets within 1 year where the power creep was like significantly major that changed the metagame like literally 2-3 times within like 6 months span, which is ridiculous. But other than that, it's a lot more long term. And then also you don't have to worry about like what Yu-Gi-Oh's metagames become this unbreakable board type of thing. So it's like when you're going first in Yu-Gi-Oh, you want to make an unbreakable board. So you're literally doing all these combo plays and your opponent's just sitting there if they don't have any hand traps to actually interact. And by the time you're finishing and your turn, the next question is, can your opponent actually even get through the cards that you're trying to do? Because a lot of these unbreakable boards have like negated effects. So anything you try to do or try to play the game in general is already negated. And sometimes some players just often scoop and go to game 2. And that's literally off turn 1, essentially. And in Vanguard, we are forced to do right progression. There's also triggers involved, which there's an RG factor in that regard too. And especially even the OT as well. So these differences make these games a lot more interactive in Vanguard than it is compared to Yu-Gi-Oh! Furthermore, with also like the reduced power creep in the metagame aspect too, they already have developed these skill sets for like card attrition. It's important to know when to commit cards to the field because your hand is your lifeline, especially when it comes to guarding. So it's a lot more important in that regard. And also like Counterblast and Soul. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Players have developed this skill set, especially from 5+ years ago, how to manage their resources really well. The third theme is the ban list and the affordability aspect. So with a ban list, oftentimes when Konami drops a ban list, 9 times out of 10, it feels like that basically your deck becomes irrelevant. So you, as a player, has spent literally hundreds of dollars on the top deck if you want to, keep up with the meta standpoint, or if your deck so happens to have expensive secret rares or generics that other decks can use, that you do spend some investment up there at that point. And all of a sudden, this ban list just restricts it or outright bans the cards. Literally cannot play your deck. There's also the situation where people wait for reprints and pick up the cards when they're cheaper from these tins or packs or whatever sets. And then what it feels like 2-3 weeks later, they drop the ban list and now they hit the cards too after they've made their sales from that sets or from that like tins that people were excited to get the reprints for that they only used for maybe a week or 2. Now imagine rinse and repeat for years and years in Yu-Gi-Oh! People can make the argument too. It's like, well, of course your deck was going to get hit. It was meta relevant. Why didn't you just sell beforehand? That's not always the case. I may say that oftentimes they get hit, but that's not necessarily that the specific deck that you have does get hit too. And it just becomes like, do I sell now so I can get my money's worth so I can invest it into the next deck that I want to invest into? But now like you're kind of forced to just get a new deck because of a ban list that just makes it completely irrelevant. And not just from the progression of power creep, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players just feel also like Konami uses that to push them to get more product sales that way for the new sets too. And to give a little more, even more specific examples, there's like generic staples. Vanguard recently has really adopted this notion of generic staples, such as like the grade 2 cyclers, Sanctitude, for example, and even in premium harmonics, like these staples that are more generic based that pretty much every deck needs in some form or fashion too. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has generics that can be played in any deck too. So there's the Macharmy cards recently that are hitting $50 to $100 a copy. They're very essential to do well because if you don't play these cards, then you are really behind potentially. It's really hard to come back from these games that use these cards that can impact your win rate, which can be frustrating if you go to regional or even at locals if it's very competitive in that sense too. And to give like a tangible example, it's like if you know premium, there's harmonics, and people complain early on because harmonics was reaching around $80 to $100 a copy from History Collection, and every deck needed one because you wanted the ticket shield. Otherwise, you literally would be at a disadvantage. Now imagine that being more necessary, also at 3 copies, and also for the modern format that's supported the most in standard. So just imagine now your standard deck needs these 3 staples that are around $80 to $100 and every deck just to keep up with the metagame. Otherwise, you'll be playing at a disadvantage every single game. It's not surprising also with Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks that are reaching $800 to not $1,000. And it can be frustrating because it's also base rarity. This is not like getting like fancy rarity cards too. Like in Vanguard, you can get a meta deck within like probably around the $200 range, give or take, just depending on your accessibility. Also doing case splits, trading with friends. Like you can really like figure some stuff out, if not cheaper too, depending on the deck too, or especially if people don't catch on real quick. But I don't think I've heard till this day somebody spending like $500, if not $800 on a more meta relevant deck that is in the modern format, like standard, for base rarity. And furthermore, like One Piece and Pokemon often are just cheaper to start with too. So like that's going against not only Yu-Gi-Oh, but that's also going against Vanguard. And I figured I mentioned that too. This theme is the fun one. This is more of like the diversity of the decks themselves and also the play style. So this is like if you pick a certain clan, you have a certain mechanic that you're playing around with. And also like artwork goes into it too. Like if you're going to pick up, let's say, Dragon Empire, you expect some dragons in it, right? Especially if you're playing like a deck like Kagero, you see a lot of dragons. So if you are into dragons, that's probably going to be a well-suited artwork type of deck that you like. Also with the Paladin clans, they're all knights. So if you like the knight aesthetic, you're going to play that too. If you're more of like, let's say in Yu-Gi-Oh, where the graveyard is actually often used in certain decks too, especially in the modern format, or if you 5-10 years ago, you played like a zombie deck, then a Grand Blue deck is very appealing because they specialize on the revival mechanic. It made them very unique because like Yu-Gi-Oh can sometimes feel like you're playing the same deck just in a different way or in a different artwork, which is not what you want. And this helps promote clan identity too in Vanguard too, and people really cling to that, and especially with the anime. Especially in the old days with Aichi becoming Blaster Blade and so on. It's very iconic. The next theme too is community and social interaction. For the most part with Vanguard, oftentimes the community aspect is very positive. It's very welcoming. I myself was welcomed pretty early on, just in general, not an issue. Friends have similar experiences too. I even stepped away from the game and then came back. Even though I had a small YouTube following at that point, people were so excited to like, hey, he's making videos again. I'm excited for future content. Like I was welcomed back too. And I've seen with the reboots, people leave Vanguard and then come back and also are welcome back still. And they're excited to play the next deck that they're playing. Of course, toxicity exists in any community too, but it's just like, it's not that high compared to Vanguard. And it also depends where you're at and all that stuff. So I'm not speaking for everybody, but it's just like that. It feels oftentimes Vanguard's community is a lot more positive than Yu-Gi-Oh's community, which people can really get a distaste from Yu-Gi-Oh's community to a degree because there is some toxicity in that and people just don't like that. In fact, some people even go to like the Edison and GOAT format too, just to get away from that too. I've seen that with those Discord service and also Reddit posts, and even talking to some players in person going to the events as well from their own experiences. And the last theme that I saw was improved pricing. Vanguard has stepped up their game with their pricing, where top 32, you literally get the energy generators and they can be worth anywhere from like $200 to $300 to like even $800 to $1,000 just for achieving top cut. Top 32 in most cases too as well. So if you're a Yu-Gi-Oh player, you realize that if you win, you just get a Nintendo Switch. And if you already have one, it's kind of like meh. And if you already have one, a couple, then it's just another thing to add to it. But just imagine just making a top 32 in Yu-Gi-Oh! And you already got in something that's at least $300 worth of value that is to your name, or you could just sell it too. In fact, it can pay part of your trip if you really see it that way, where like you want to go to events, but the finances can be a little tight. And if the pricing is worth it, then at that point you can kind of like pay yourself back and be able to do more events because you just enjoy playing the game and meeting new people and going to places and all these things when it comes to like regionals. This is one of the major reasons that 2024 was a rough year for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro players, and they've made videos and posts that they were just flat out quitting Yu-Gi-Oh! And going to compete to different TCGs such as like One Piece, Lorcana, for example. I think Lorcana was the big one with the more enticing pricing. And this is one of the things that the community really wanted for Bushiroad to really step up a game. And I'm glad that they did, at least to this season. And this season, from what I've seen, has been an improvement overall too. So kudos to like Bushiroad actually doing something about the pricing, especially in this time. So those are like the major aspects that Yu-Gi-Oh players see Vanguard really distinguish itself or like something to worth pick up compared to another TCG. What are the 3 things that I think Bushiroad could do to really help fix these issues that people are complaining recently, but also to grow beyond with possible new players coming into the game in more recent times? So number 1 is an appropriate ban list with a goal in mind. And so what do I mean by that? So when it comes to the ban list, I oftentimes see a spectrum of players. One side of the spectrum is if they could just ban certain decks or certain cards to make the format more diverse. Like different decks should be able to compete, and you should be able to see multiple decks throughout like a top cut distribution and also in the Swiss rounds. There's like the other side aspect too that just wants a certain deck or certain cards to be just nuked. Like they're just done with it. I lean to the more diversity side of things. So what this would help is if they actually regulate a ban list every 3 to 4 months and start out with slight taps, essentially. So start hitting decks at a slight taps. This can be like ratios to like maybe like to 2 cards, or like choice restrictions, or things of that nature. And what this will do is that they can assess the effects of that ban list, let the metagame evolve in those 3 to 4 months, then do another one and start tapping other stuff. I don't think there's anything major right now where it needs a major obvious ban, because when I think of a major banning, like an emergency ban, I think of like when Vanguard had like the big 6 where New Adao was a thing, and also Fenrir. And if you remember those decks, Pepper Ridge Farms remembers those decks, right? Especially in recent times where people are complaining about, like this past year, above Shiranui, Shoto Doji, and then of course now Levy Dress. You know, I still remember New Adao and Fenrir. And then of course later on we got the Mystery Flare and also Odysseus Ripple abuse that we got too. And if you remember when those hits were obvious, pretty much everybody was happy in the community. The reason for like these like 3 to 4 love taps essentially every so often, it avoids where the next decks in power just rise up, and you just knock out the tier 1 decks out, and now the tier 2 decks become tier 1. And it's like, did you really solve the problem in the sense of making it diverse, or did you just really make tier 2 the new tier 1? And theoretically other decks could shine more, but it's just like oftentimes that's what happens unless there's like power creep. And again, there's no depending on the support in standard or premium, that can change, and of course how gradual they're doing it too. I think Bushiroad can really use a ban list and the natural power creep of sets to have a healthy progression of just like new cards coming into the flow, but still have the old cards still like viable still, without players feeling like they had to just spend money still entirely because their deck is irrelevant. Number 2 is really the whole promo situation. I know, as I mentioned, that's a common complaint with the community, and Ali brought it to more light in this situation too. Just make promos like not mandatory cards. It's really that simple. It's like just use maybe like alternate arts of like common cards that, you know, if people want the alternate arts, they can get it, but don't make it if a certain deck needs to have a playable or compete in the next level of decks that come up in the new metagame, don't make it so mandatory, because like not everybody has access to locals. Vanguard is also a niche game too, so it's harder to find a locals with Vanguard already. The other aspect too is like just keep the mandatory cards in the actual sets themselves, like the booster sets. That way people are still enticed to buy booster boxes and cases and open them, and then have a secondary market through TCG Player and so on to be able to buy singles. Like it should be still like that. Like if people want the mandatory cards and they're new, they should just be able to get from the sets themselves, really. If you want to make promos still relevant to a locals or maybe to like a shop, it could be also like the alternate arts for triggers or like certain units, but also just like maybe reprints of like common stuff that may not be like as necessary but are still useful in value. Good examples are like the effect triggers. It would be nice just to have more effect triggers and crits, you know, fronts, draw triggers, even like heals to an extent, just as promos. And that way people at locals can even trade with their friends on the spot, maybe complete their playset of crits for Cater Sanctuary, or their playset of draws for Stoicheia, and so on, all these things, right? And then later on, we already seen that they're making new front triggers with different effects, like the ones that go into Soul after you guard with them. Then they can do those at the later rotation or something like that. So it doesn't make promos completely useless, but it also doesn't make a player feel like I can't play my Cristianos deck or my Estrom deck or my MOB deck or my Prison deck because there's some promo behind it that I have to get it from a shop, and hopefully I can get it by doing well or trades and all that stuff. The third point is no different, and even Differentified had mentioned this recently too. Totally agree. They just need to have more relevant and complete deck sets. What do I mean by this? So think about like the start decks that we got last year, like Cristianos, Astrum, and so on. Those were not good. Like, for real, like you can't just open it out of the box and just hope to play competing wise. They didn't even have the effects on them, which is not that hard for new players, especially if they're coming from another TCG. Most players have already played something else, essentially, especially if there's like a digital client like Hearthstone, for example, and other like TCGs. It's going to be easy to pick up, essentially. What was really good that they did right last year was the premium deck set. So think about like the Revenger one, the Musketeers, and also the Joe Knights. The Revenger one I feel was the most relevant and complete. It wasn't wholly complete, but it was the most complete. So literally players can take this Revenger deck and right out of the box, you may need just like 3 to 5 cards more and you have a full complete Raging deck. In fact, if you bought 2 of the deck sets, you were pretty much good to go. And maybe you just bought like a side stuff to add to it. Like if you wanted to get the Legion, for example, you would just have to find the Legion on TCG Player. but you can still play like Raging Form with Raging Fall, and also have the Raging Rap Stride, and have Sanctitude, and have Harmonics, and have Effect Triggers, and like PG draws. All these things that literally are pretty much going to be required for any deck in recent times. Do that more, but also do that for Standard. Standard is going to be the most supported format as we've seen it already, and it's going to be more than likely the entry for new players. So I think that they should have more relevant and complete deck sets for that format. So that way a player, just like in Yu-Gi-Oh! Literally in Yu-Gi-Oh! They had structured decks over the years where they were like 10 to 15 bucks each. You bought 3 of them because they only have 1-ofs in them, and a play set in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is 3 copies. So you bought 3 of these for like $30 to $40, and you can actually compete at your locals and at your regionals and do fairly well. In fact, some people top just by playing 3 structure decks, and that's it. You know, ones that really come to mind, like 10 years ago, they did the Monarchs one. Like that didn't even need an extra deck. So literally they could just buy the structure deck and be able to win a lot of matchups and do fairly well. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just one deck out of the metagame where like the rest of the decks still can be built with the main sets. And even for existing players, this is good because this can be an easy deck to pick up as a side deck that you can play for fun. In fact, I go to locals, everybody has like a Revenger deck or a Musketeers deck or a June Knight deck on the side for premium. Like it just makes it that much easier, and people can expand and try that out because it's complete. They don't have to have the hassle of buying singles or going through multiple sets and hoping that they get everything. It's a lot more work. And so if you're going to have new players really have a good taste in Vanguard, having a relevant and complete deck set will really help tremendously. It's okay if they spend a little more, but knowing that it's complete and relevant, I think that's the most important thing. This is good with like the Gear Chronicle and Shuri deck sets. Literally, you spend on that, you're going to do well in that metagame, and it did during those times too. So Bushiroad has already done this, especially for Standard. So keep doing it, but it doesn't always have to be just a stride deck set. It can be a new grade 3 boss. It just comes from a complete deck set versus a booster set. Do it in addition, essentially. And so those are the 3 main points that, you know, Bushiroad could do to help fix things and help grow beyond. Still, they're doing a good job. Like, I still do content for Vanguard. I still, you know, love and play Vanguard, and I share it to others. Like, people that don't even play TCGs, they ask me, what do I play? And I had to explain them, like, Card Fight Vanguard. I actually still go out of my way to explain what it is compared to, like, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, all these other ones that they may know, because Vanguard is still a niche game. What's your experiences? Let me know what you guys think. Like, what are your thoughts too about like Vanguard and Bushiroad? Like, can Bushiroad really like make these changes or maybe fix some things? Well, what do you think in your eyes would help? And if you're interested in like these types of videos, feel free to check out my recent video talking about Standard, specifically for long-time players. Are they still playing Standard in today's metagame, especially with the enticingness of encounter decks and stride deck sets too? Till the next time, amigos. Bye.